Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. This one, Time Travel, the Most Compelling Cases, written by Ilza. Thank you, Ilza. Read by me. I've never read it before. That's the format of the show. Welcome if you're new here. Time travel. I mean, real. We're all moving forward in time in about 1 second per second. But backwards time travel and stuff, I don't think that's possible. I think, just no. But let's jump in. Let's see if there's anything that does compel me, because we're looking at the most compelling cases. Let's go. If you could travel anywhere in time, where would you go? Would you want to go forward in time to see whether humanity manages to survive itself and actually thrive in the future? Or would you travel back in time to some significant historical event to answer the question once and for all, did Harold get an arrow in the eye at the Battle of Hastings? And what happened to the missing Roman legion? I don't know. I like those things I just don't think are that important. I'm just like, it's not that much of a mystery. I mean, if it is a mystery, I just don't care about it that much. I think I'd definitely go forward in time to see what we're up to in the future, to see what we achieve. Personally, while I'd love to see history unfold, I have no intention of staying anywhere without indoor plumbing, hot showers, and antibiotics for more than a couple of hours. Yes. The past was filled with diseases. It was a bad time. The idea of traveling through time, changing history, fixing mistakes, or catching a glimpse of the future is one that has fascinated us for centuries, but it was H.G. Wells who first introduced us to the concept of building a machine that could travel through time. Was it really? Was he the first one to come up with the idea of an actual time machine in his novel, The Time Machine? Surely people had the idea of some sort of machine that could travel through time before that book. It's not that old in the grand scheme of things. Of course, these days, anything can be a time machine, police boxes, DeLoreans, even hot tubs, and anyone can be a time traveler. In fact, you don't even need a machine to travel through time. Sometimes it just kind of happens. I think we can all agree that most time travel stories are products of vivid imagination and a liberal dosage of medicinal herbs. But every once in a while, a story comes along that makes you pause and wonder, is time travel possible? No. I don't know. I've never come across a story where I've been like, oh, wow, yeah, they did travel through time. There's always been a rational explanation, but let's continue.
Have you ever tried Googling your name? It's scary how much personal info pops up, right? Your address, your phone number, sometimes even that of your relatives, which is weird. Look, this data doesn't end up online by accident, and it definitely doesn't stay there on purpose. Incogni is a hands-off service that removes your exposed data from people's search sites and data broker networks. But their unlimited plan, well, that takes it even further. With custom removals, you can drop a link to any site showing your info, court records, obscure databases, random people finder sites. You know the ones I mean, just Google your name. And Incogni's privacy team will handle the takedown for you. There's no emails, there's no forms, there's no hours wasted with support, and they won't even listen to you. You just copy, you paste. Incogni take care of the rest and you disappear. Look, take your data back. It's yours. Use the code unknown at incogni.com/unknown for 60% off the annual plan. It's a great deal, it's a great service, just makes your life a little bit more secure. No identity theft and all of that nonsense. And now back to today's video.
So many time travelers. I wasn't entirely prepared for just how many time travel stories there are out there. Most people who claim to have traveled through time usually end up doing it sort of by accident rather than design, experiencing what is called a time slip. A time slip happens when someone accidentally travels through time without the help of a time machine. Obviously, science doesn't support this. There's a lot on this channel that science doesn't support, but there are a lot of time slip stories, and many of them share similar characteristics. People experiencing bad weather, or just feeling anxious and out of place, as you might. It's like, oh, I'm in the medieval times. A little bit anxious about that. As you would be, and you would feel a little bit out of place here, because you are. Sadly, though, some of the best time travel tales have already been proven to be hoaxes. The story of Rudolf Fens, a man from 1876 who appeared in Times Square in the 1950s only to be hit and killed by a cab, talk about bad luck, has been traced back to science fiction short story I'm Scared, written in 1951 by Jack Finney. Alright, I've heard of that one, so it actually just didn't happen at all. Andrew Carlson, a man supposedly arrested for insider trading after turning an $800 portfolio into a $350 million portfolio in 2 weeks in 2003, who then claimed he was a time traveler going back in time to make some money. Well, he never existed. The story came from a satirical newspaper, the Weekly World News. Oh, I feel like I've heard of that. However, as far as motives go, I reckon traveling back in time to play the stock market and make millions is the most plausible excuse for building a time machine that I've come across. Also, you'd be like, nah, I wasn't insider trading, I'm from the future. They'll be like, your lawyer's like, you're going to need a different defense there, mate. As for Sergei Ponomarenko, who was found wandering the streets of Kiev in 2006 and supposedly came from the 1950s, he also never existed. Neither did his psychiatrist or his supposed fiancée. As a writer, I appreciate the details behind the story, but that's the problem with technology. Sure, you can try and fake your time travel experience with Photoshop and AI, as in the Ponomarenko case, but we can use the same technology to prove you're a big fat liar. Does that mean time slips and time travel is impossible? Well, no, not necessarily. Let's see if we can convince you that time slips happen and time travelers are, in fact, very real. Well, I'm going to need a hell of a lot of convincing, Ilsa. Let's see. The time-traveling hipster. Way back in 1941, the South Fork Bridge in Goldbridge, British Columbia, that's up in Canada, was reopening after it had been washed away by a flood in November 1940. As is usually the case with important events, there were a lot of cameras and many pictures of the small crowd gathering to witness the occasion. This isn't exactly the Golden Gate Bridge, but I suppose bridges don't open every day, and Goldbridge isn't what you'd call a bustling metropolis. Today it only houses around 40 permanent residents. Why does a town like that have a bridge? How much does that bridge cost per resident? God damn. So it's not like anyone had anything else planned that day. However, while I'm sure the bridge is interesting, what's more interesting is the photo of a man that looks rather out of place. The image first showed up in the Boulogne Pioneer Museum's exhibit titled Their Past Lives Here. In 2010, the museum digitized the photos in the collection and made them available online, which is when the whole hipster in the 1940s thing really gained traction. Yes, I remember this photo coming out. I've got a copy of it here. And it does look like a dude who is dressed and has the hair of a modern day person, or like someone from around 2010. That looks about exactly right, and it looks like he's holding a camera or something. But, I mean, he's just probably dressed a bit weird, isn't he? For the time. The photo is proven to be genuine. There's no photoshopping or AI touch-ups visible. Initially, the photo caused much excitement because people claimed that the man's clothes, a dark printed t-shirt or hoodie with a huge M and wraparound sunglasses, were too modern, and his camera was very small for the 1940s. However, critics insist that the man isn't wearing anything that wasn't available at the time, and sadly, they are right. The style of the sunglasses the man is wearing was already available in the 1920s. Well, those wraparound sunglasses do look so modern. But yeah, I mean, they kind of look like, they also could look like those old school, Welser glasses or whatever, the like almost steampunk-esque. The shirt, which really looks like a printed t-shirt at first glance, upon closer inspection is a sweater with a sewn-on emblem. The Montreal Maroons, an ice hockey team which played in the NHL from 1924 to 1938, has the exact same emblem, so clearly our man loves ice hockey. Of course, the Montreal Maroons had light-coloured shirts with a dark M, whereas our traveller's wearing a dark sweater with a light-coloured M, but maybe that's just a colour preference. The camera is much smaller than what we're used to from that time, but Kodak was already manufacturing portable cameras of that size by 1938. Sadly, we can't make out the exact make and model of the camera he's holding. While it's widely considered a hoax these days by critics, you have to admit that the man does look out of place. To me, it's not really what the man is wearing that makes him stand out, but rather how he's wearing it. Yeah, he just does look out of place. I think maybe he's just everyone else is kind of wearing more formal attire, and he's just come casually dressed, and maybe this is just how people casually dressed back in the day, because maybe people, when they're having their photos taken or went to somewhere where they would be having their photos taken, they're dressed more smartly, because getting a photo taken was like a rarer occurrence. And this guy just is like, I don't give a shit. Everyone else in the photos dressed rather formally, exactly. The men are wearing suits, some of them are wearing ties, and almost all the men are wearing hats. No one else in the photo is wearing sunglasses. While the man's hairstyle seems completely out of place, according to experts, the style wasn't very common, but it also wasn't completely new. Yeah, I have to say, it does look like a fairly bog-standard haircut, but I guess maybe people just had different haircuts back in the day. However, the fact that our man doesn't seem to own a hairbrush is certainly very modern in my humble opinion. Our man also seems to sport of a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow, whereas everyone else is completely clean-shaven. In fairness, it's not the best quality photo, so maybe it's just shadows. Considering that the size of camera he's carrying only became available in 1938, 3 years before the photo was taken, we can assume our man has money. He can clearly afford the newest tech. However, he doesn't carry himself like a man of wealth and status. This is not a casual day labourer who stumbled upon a bridge reopening with his fancy camera around his neck. Rather, it feels like someone who did the research to get the right clothes and accessories, but then failed to put it all together in a way typical of the era, like this was his first attempt at period cosplay. Whether he's a man at a time or a man trying to pass himself off as a higher social class than he actually is, I'm not sure, but he really doesn't seem to belong to this crowd. No, it's just a dude who's dressed a little bit differently. It's possible that he was just an eccentric rich guy, but if that's the case, he was very eccentric and very reclusive since he's never been identified. And people have tried. Yeah, but you could just be rich and not notable. Like, most rich guys are not notable, they're just quietly rich. Again, you would expect someone with wealth to show up in more photos attending other fancy events, especially in a community that small. Oh, that's true, the community is small. Of course, why a time traveler would go through all the effort to see the reopening of the South Fork Bridge is a bit of a mystery. So eccentric recluse who for some reason decided to attend the reopening of a bridge, or a time traveler doing a test run in preparation for attending a much bigger and but noteworthy event? Who knows? I know. He's just a dude who showed up and he's got a fancy camera and he doesn't really care about how he looks. The mysterious John Titor. In the early 2000s, when the internet was new, dial-up connections were still a thing, and before Google was launched, a mysterious figure appeared on online bulletin boards under the screen name TimeTravel_0, claiming to be a time traveler. He eventually identified himself as John Titor, and he had a remarkable story to tell. Is this the guy who was posting on Reddit or something later? No, oh wait, this must be online bulletin board, sorry. There was another one with a Reddit time travel guy, right? At some point later? Anyway, according to John Titor, he was an American soldier based in Tampa, Florida, in the year of our Lord 2036. However, Titor described an America very different from the one we know and I would say love, but we all know that's a lie. Titor claimed that the presidential election of 2005 led to civil unrest in America, including some Waco-style standoffs. This unrest eventually boiled over into full-blown civil war. By 2008, the US was divided into 5 regions. Finally, by 2015, this unrest spilled over the borders, leading to a brief but intense Third World War with a nuclear exchange between the US and Russia. That's always a fan favorite, which killed around 3 billion people. Good lord. Would that be a brief nuclear exchange? Half of the world's population, basically. Obviously, Washington, D.C. and Jacksonville, Florida were on the hit list, so the US capital moved to Omaha, Nebraska, which seems like an odd choice, but I'm sure they had their reasons. I don't know, maybe it's it's an odd choice, which is why they chose it. Those that managed to survive all this chaos grew closer together, leading to a more family and community-oriented lifestyle. What, by 2036 or whatever it was? Well, like 20 years later, everything's perfect. Large industrial complexes never recovered, so instead of truckloads of stuff that no one actually needs, food and livestock is grown and sold locally, so it seems that we all get a little less materialistic, which probably isn't a bad thing. Yeah, but what was a bad thing was 3 billion people dying. People also read more, which is great for writers and libraries, and religion is taken seriously, which doesn't sound like a brilliant idea to me, but hey, they did just survive a nuclear war, so I guess that would make anyone a little more religious. Time travel is finally invented in 2034 by CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. Yes, because after the big nuclear war where half the world's population died, they were like, let's just put loads of money into investigating time travel rather than recovering from the horrible nuclear war. Titor even explains how this technology works with singularity engines and magnetic fields, which didn't make a lot of sense to me. Once this technology was invented, General Electric began manufacturing what he called displacement units, which became very important to the US government. Titor also described his own time machine, claiming it was made up of a stationary mass temporal displacement unit powered by 2 topspin dual positive singularities. Right, this guy's going down the Star Trek route of, yes, the blah 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 blah. That's why we could blah 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 blah. It's like, just technobabble. Honestly, it seems like he's just stringing random words together, but perhaps the more scientifically minded among you understand what the hell he's talking about. Probably not. I don't think he understands what he's talking about because it's just technobabble. Initially, this time machine was installed in the trunk of a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette convertible, but it was later upgraded to a 1987 Chevy Suburban. I guess he couldn't get his hands on a DeLorean. Why? Why take this? This guy's like very old by this point. By 2036, this somewhat utopian society have found themselves in a bit of a pickle with the looming Unix timeout. Apparently this is, or was, a genuine concern. According to people that are smarter than me, on January the 19th, 2038, computer systems that use 32-bit integers to count time will enter a 32-bit overflow. This will cause dates to roll over to 1901, which will cause some operating systems and software to malfunction. 64-bit systems apparently don't face the same problem, though. Okay, this sounds like the Millennium Bug or something. I'm a little surprised that a society that's capable of building a time machine couldn't find a way around this particular problem, but I guess okay. The Y2K bug was a similar problem for those who don't remember it. Really, folks, it wasn't that long ago. And so, yes, it was a quarter of a century ago. And some commercial software and devices did temporarily go down because of it, but unfortunately, the world didn't end. In Titor's time, instead of investing in computer literacy and research, the government decided that the easiest way to solve this problem was to send someone back in time to 1975 to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer to debug the machines still used in 2036. That makes no sense, but okay. To be fair, governments aren't known for supplying their employees with state-of-the-art equipment, and using a nuke to kill a spider also sounds a bit like something the US government would do. But why did they need an IBM 5100? That seems oddly specific. Well, apparently the IBM 5100 had a special feature that at the time of Titor's post hadn't been made public. The computer had the ability to eliminate code between different programming languages. IBM kept this nifty feature to themselves because they didn't want their competition to exploit it. By the year 2000, I doubt anyone would have cared about this feature. Technology had moved on quite a bit, but it suggests that whoever wrote these posts had some knowledge of the inner workings of the IBM 5100, so either a computer scientist or a time traveler. Or maybe just someone with access to the internet who can look up the manual of the 5100. Right? Titor claimed that it had been chosen for this mission because his paternal grandfather had been directly involved in the programming and assembly of the 5100. Why would that make a difference? So in short, Titor is going back in 1975 to pick up an old IBM computer to debug legacy computer systems in 2036 that are facing the Unix timeout era. Are you still with me? Yes, I am following what I believe to be a nonsense story, but I am following. However, if Titor was sent to 1975 to pick up a PC, what the heck was he doing posting on a forum in the year 2000? Well, according to our time traveler, he dropped in for personal reasons. He wanted to pick up some pictures that had been lost during the future civil war, visit some family members, and warn people about all these upcoming wars and a mad cow pandemic that would rock the world. Well, for people, and cows at least. Right, this seems like a terrible... It's like they send you back in time. I feel like your grandfather being there is a reason you definitely shouldn't go. Because you could be like, hey, Grandpa, and then Grandpa, butterfly effects the shit out of himself, and you never exist. Titor made a lot of predictions that never came true. There was no American Civil War in 2005, no Third World War in 2015. However, this case is easy to explain. According to Titor in 2036, the many worlds interpretation of time is considered correct. In short, this interpretation of time suggests that each decision you make creates a new timeline, so there are infinite timelines, and in at least one of them you're probably dating a supermodel. That means that with every decision Titor made, like stopping over in 2000 and telling the whole world his story, he was changing the timeline. Thanks to this... Wait, so they wanted to go send someone back in time, not to prevent the pandemic, not to prevent the Third World War, not to prevent the Civil War, but to get a computer to debug some code in some systems in 2036. John Titor, you've been smoking the crack, my dude. Thanks to this interference, we managed to avoid the Civil War and World War III, for now at least. So I guess, thank you, John Titor. Titor gave a very convoluted explanation as to how he managed to travel from his timeline to ours, and his last post then appeared in late March 2001. After that, he vanished, never to be heard from again. Now, an IP address associated with Titor's posts was geolocated to Kissimmee, Florida, and a PI concluded that Titor was most likely a hoax fabricated by entertainment lawyer Larry Haber and his computer scientist brother Richard. In 2018, a multimedia artist, Joseph Matheny, creator of the early alternate reality game Ong's Hat, stepped forward to claim that he had worked for unnamed individuals who were behind the Titor legend, and the whole thing was a literary experiment. Neither of these claims has been verified, though. I know what you're thinking. This sounds like one big hoax that's already been debunked, so why am I including it in this list? Firstly, it's never been proven that Larry Haber and his bro were behind all of this. Secondly, while most of Titor's predictions didn't come true, he did get a few things right. Titor predicted a shuttle disaster where the shuttle would explode due to an overheating problem, which is exactly what happened when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entering the atmosphere on February the 1st, 2003. Well, it wasn't really an overheating problem, was it? It was I suppose they were heat-absorbing tiles, like that came off during the launch and then caused it to burn up. So I guess technically, it overheated. It's unfortunate that he didn't give an exact date. Not for him, because he'd have given the wrong date, because, maybe he'd given the right date, but it would be a hell of a guess. He also predicted closer relations between China and Russia and growing instability in the West, and claimed that China was close to putting a man in orbit, which they did in October 2003. Interestingly, he also predicted that the US would use false reports of weapons of mass destruction to work the public into a frenzy so they would support another war, which in the end led to the Iraq War. As for nuclear war, we've had some close calls over the last couple of years, the North Korea crisis of 2017 and Russia threatening the use of nuclear weapons in the war with Ukraine, which is still going strong. These come to mind. Titor also describes the Arab-Israeli conflict, claiming that it was a milestone leading up to World War III, though not a direct cause. Considering what's happening in Gaza at the moment, this is a bit chilling. No, it's not. It's like, there's going to be... This dude literally there's going to be a flare-up of tensions in the Middle East. Oh, there is there, John? Oh, how could you possibly know that? In the Middle East? No, John, no. No way. Well, we're well overdue for that American Civil War. It was the loss of constitutional freedom under the Patriot Act and similar legislation which kicked that party off, and it's something we're seeing happening in America right now. America has faced a lot of civil unrest over the last couple of years, so perhaps the Civil War might still be on the cards after all. As is the nature of predictions, Titor rarely included dates, and he had that many worlds interpretation of time as a handy fail-safe should his predictions not come to pass. You could also argue that anyone paying close attention to international affairs might be able to guess some of these events unfolding, but I'm not sure anyone would have been able to guess that the US would start using The Handmaid's Tale as a how-to guide instead of as a warning. It's not that bad, is it? So was John Titor a time traveler, hopping from one timeline to another, changing events as he went, or was he an entertainment lawyer with a keen interest in international relations, a handy, tiny, whiny terminology handbook, and a pessimistic view on space shuttles? Yep. I think he's like, oh yeah, okay, well, one space shuttle already burned up. You could be like, another one will. It's quite dangerous being, on a space shuttle. And then there's going to be tension in the Middle East. Oh, there is there? So no, I don't believe this at all. Flying into the future. In 1935, Sir Robert Victor Goddard, a pilot for the Royal Air Force, had a rather strange experience. He was flying from his home base in Andover, England, on a mission to Scotland in an open cockpit biplane when he experienced what could only be described as a time slip. En route to his destination in Scotland, Goddard flew over the RAF base at Drem, an abandoned airfield in Scotland which had been decommissioned after World War I. The airfield was in complete shambles. 4 of the hangars had been destroyed, and there were cattle grazing in between the buildings that were still standing. It's quite cool. I went to I can't even remember where it was. I was on some trip somewhere, and this was a long time ago, and there was an abandoned airfield or something with these huge hangars, which had just grass going in them. It was really cool. It's kind of like this, but then I didn't travel through time to back when it was operational. That didn't happen. I just went to an abandoned old airbase. Grass had even started pushing through the tarmac. In short, the base was in complete and utter disrepair. On his return flight back to England, Goddard encountered a severe storm. He was being pelted by heavy rain, and since he was in an open cockpit without any navigational assistance, it wasn't a great situation to be in. With his sight and thus his ability to navigate somewhat impaired, Goddard decided to try and climb higher to fly above the clouds, but he only made it to around 8,000 feet when he lost control of the aircraft and started spinning downwards at an alarming speed. He described the clouds around him becoming a strange yellow-brownish color. Suddenly, at the last minute before crashing, the storm was gone and Goddard was able to regain control of his spinning aircraft. The sun was shining brightly and he found himself crossing the Drem airbase again, only this time the airfield wasn't abandoned. To the contrary, it was fully operational and bustling with activity. Trainer planes painted yellow stood on the runway, and engineers dressed in blue overalls were working on some of the airplanes. He even noticed a monoplane, which he didn't recognize. Now, all of this is a bit odd because at the time the RAF didn't have yellow-painted planes and the engineers wore brown. However, the violent storm suddenly returned, sweeping our pilot back up into the skies, and he lost sight of the now fully operational airfield. Well, just a comment there, he's in an open cockpit at 8,000 feet? I think 10,000 feet is where you start getting a bit loopy. So, I don't know, but this is a very stressful situation that he's in. Probably maybe just a hallucination, he's imagining things, I don't know. When he finally got to his own base, he told officers what he'd experienced, but unsurprisingly, he was met with doubt. He kept quiet after this for a long time out of fear of being dismissed from the RAF entirely. However, in 1939, Goddard found himself back at Drem Airfield. The airfield had been recommissioned in preparation for the Second World War. On the tarmac, engineers in blue overalls, which had only recently been changed from brown, were working on yellow-painted trainer planes and the new monoplane, the Magister, which only took to the skies in 1937, 2 years after Goddard's flight to Scotland. So did Sir Victor Goddard fly into the future? I need to know whether that stuff was written down about the blue thing and the yellow thing and the training plane and the monoplane. Did he write it down at some point was there some evidence that he said it at the time? Even if he did, I don't think it's evidence of time travel, but it would definitely be a push in the right direction. You may ask why the story is considered as proof by time travel believers. It's not like we have physical evidence like grainy photos, but in this case it's more to do with the person telling the story. You see, Sir Goddard wasn't just your run-of-the-mill loon telling wild tales. He was a respected air marshal who went on to be awarded Knight Commander of the Order of Bath and the Order of the British Empire. Yeah, I mean, he's a knight, he's like Sir Goddard. He was selected to read engineering at Jesus College at the University of Cambridge and studied at Imperial College, London, and he was eventually appointed as Deputy Director of Intelligence at the Air Ministry, not a position you'd expect to be held by a man who's a few clowns short of a Happy Meal. He was an intelligent, well-educated man, respected by fellow officers. Of course, the man did serve in World War I, and World War II was looming menacingly on the horizon, so was Sir Victor Goddard a time traveler or a soldier experiencing hallucinations brought about by PTSD, a condition not very well understood at the time? Well, I mean, I think it's the latter, isn't it? The Moberly Jourdain Affair. I've heard of this one. This is the people who think they went back in time at Versailles, and I'm pretty sure it ends with them just saying they made it up, right? Or just not speaking about it again, being like, I'm a bit embarrassed about that time I made up that story about my time travel in Versailles. I was just trying to be a little bit edgy. Back in 1901, two Oxford academics, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, were visiting the Palace of Versailles in Paris. Charlotte had been hired as the first principal of the St. Hugh's College at Oxford University, founded in 1886 as a women's college. She was in need of a deputy or vice principal, and the position went to Eleanor. The trip to Paris was, in part, for the women to get to know each other a little better before taking their respective positions at the college. However, the visit became a bonding experience like no other. On August the 10th, the two women found themselves exploring the Palace of Versailles, which had been the home of the French royal court up to the French Revolution and where Marie Antoinette spent some of her last happy days before finding herself on the executioner's block. The women decided that they would like to visit the Petit Trianon, originally built by Louis XV for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. But in 1774, the young king, Louis XVI, gave the chateau and its surrounding gardens to his queen, Marie Antoinette, as a private retreat. It eventually became her sanctuary, where only her inner circle was admitted, which caused some friction at court, but that's not really important. The Petit Trianon is a fair distance from the main palace, so the ladies expected a bit of a walk. It was women's first visit to Versailles, so they relied on a guidebook to get to the chateau, but soon got lost when they missed a wide drive that would have taken them straight to the chateau, and instead they walked down a narrow lane. And that's when things started getting freaky. Both women stated that they started feeling a strange sense of anxiety and melancholy, and they both felt that something was very wrong. They passed by a house, and Charlotte saw a woman waving a white cloth from a window. They kept walking, but they were feeling very uneasy. You know, that feeling you get when you know you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. Finally, they started coming across some people. They met two men wearing strange clothes, long green coats, and three cornered hats, assuming they were gardening staff despite their strange clothes. It's Paris, after all. They asked them for directions. The men pointed them further down the path, and they were polite but not exceptionally friendly. They passed by another cottage where a woman and a teenage girl were standing outside. They were wearing late 1700s clothing, and according to the woman, the pair looked like waxworks. There was no wind, and the trees had a somewhat unreal quality to them. One of the women described the trees as looking like trees done on tapestry, flat, with no lighting or shading. Eventually, they passed another man sitting in the gardens who gave them the heebie-jeebies. He had a dark complexion, and his expression was described as evil, but unseeing. That's very specific. Yes, the guy's got that expression of evil, but unseeing evil. No wonder he gave them the creeps. However, another man then came rushing up to them, thankfully guiding them away from the sinister figure and gave them directions to the chateau. They finally escaped from this strange wooded twilight and reached the area that had once been a private sanctuary for Marie Antoinette. Everything seemed basically unchanged, which was very odd considering that the monarchy had fallen more than 100 years before. The women decided to start with the chapel and ran into a man leaving the chapel who warned them not to approach the Queen's private entrance, which is good advice at any palace. After visiting the chapel on their way to the chateau itself, the women passed a young woman sitting in a low seat in the grass, sketching the landscape. She was dressed in a green top, a light-coloured skirt, and a white hat. Interestingly, only Charlotte saw this woman. Eleanor didn't. Finally, after a most eventful journey, the women reached the chateau and upon entering found themselves surrounded by tourists from 1901. The strange feeling that had been haunting them all the way to the chateau had also vanished. Oh, there we go. I mean, this is all great, fascinating. It's an interesting story, isn't it? But that's all this is, right? It's just a story someone's telling. It took the women a few days before they finally compared notes to do a sanity check, and I don't blame them. I'd be totally freaking out and questioning my state of mind. Yes, if I found myself suddenly in the past, I wouldn't take to the internet and tell people about my time travel journey. I'd take to the internet and find a local psychiatrist. Because something ain't right upstairs. Both women shared an interest in spiritualism, of course they did, which was all the rage in 1901, and their first thought was that they'd experienced a haunting. Right. However, they were intrigued by this weird experience and started doing a bit of research on the grounds and the people who lived there. They also went back on many occasions to retrace their steps, but no luck. Buildings that had been in good condition the first time were now just ruins. The paths they took were no longer there. A bridge they crossed on the way to the chateau existed in 1792 according to old maps, but it was long gone by 1901. Farm buildings that were standing in the 1700s had been torn down by 1901, and the door on the chapel wouldn't budge. Yeah, it's so weird. Like, in a big city like Paris, at Versailles, there used to be farm buildings because there was farmland in Versailles in Paris. Just because it wasn't always like, I've got some old pictures of the city where I live, Prague, and it's like, oh, so there's this little bit of city, and you're seeing this, the artist who's drawing it is looking over and drawing the city, but then all around him he's just drawn fields. And I'm like, that's now very much city. A staff member finally told them that the door probably hadn't been opened since the royal family lived in that place over 100 years before, yet the women had entered through that door when they visited that very chapel on their first visit. Charlotte also concluded that the woman sketching was none other than Marie Antoinette herself, after studying a painting of the Queen by Adolf Müller, which, according to one of Marie Antoinette's companions, was a very close likeness of the Queen herself. Marie Antoinette was known also to spend time at the Petit Trianon with her sketchbook. In 1911, the women published a book simply called An Adventure under the pseudonyms of Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lamont. Their true identities were only revealed after their deaths. The women were well-educated and highly respected, so it seems odd that they would risk their hard-earned reputations by trying to sell a piece of fiction as fact. I mean, well, they didn't. They didn't risk their reputations because they used pseudonyms so they can cash in using their big brains and a story to sell fiction as fact and make a bunch of money. It's pretty smart. It's pretty smart. Some say the fact that they use pseudonyms is just proof of the whole thing, right? But it was a work of fiction, sorry. But the women weren't naive. They knew that a story like this could cause some raised eyebrows whether it was true or not. The book was quite the hit, but was it fiction or fact? Well, it was fiction. And they just labeled it as fact so they can sell more books. It's all pretty clever, but it doesn't mean it doesn't make the time travel thing real. Some critics believe that it's a purely fictional story presented as fact, indeed, while others described it as a shared delusion due to heat stroke. There could be another explanation, though. Around 1901, Robert de Montesquieu, who lived near the Palace of Versailles, would often host parties where his guests dressed up in period fashion, so perhaps Charles and Eleanor wandered into one of those parties by accident. Apparently, de Montesquieu had a dark complexion and a pockmarked face, which would certainly have been described as evil-looking by two lost and confused academics. Of course, this would suggest that they managed to get so lost that they left the palace grounds at some point and managed to make their way back again to the Petit Trianon without help, which seems unlikely since they've never been there before. It also wouldn't explain the strange feelings both women described while on their little adventure, or the fact that they'd crossed a bridge that no longer existed. No, look, it's quite simple. They made it up to sell a book. The women firmly believed that they had experienced a time slip to the 1780s, shortly before the fall of the French monarchy, and just before Marie Antoinette was sent to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where she eventually would meet her maker via guillotine. So, time-traveling academics seeing the last days before anarchy in the streets of Paris, or a shared delusion turned into a very imaginative book. Well, it's an imaginative book, isn't it? Future technology in the past. There are a surprising number of photos apparently showing modern technology, specifically cell phones, way before they were actually available. Once again, the vast majority of these images are photoshopped. Surprise! But there are one or two that might have something else going on. First off, we have Charlie Chaplin's Time Traveller. In October 2010, George Clark, a Northern Irish filmmaker from Belfast, discovered something most unusual and promptly uploaded a clip onto YouTube titled Chaplin's Time Traveller. Clark was analyzing bonus material from the DVD of Charlie Chaplin's movie The Circus when he made the rather surprising discovery. The footage was taken at the movie's LA premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theatre way back in 1928. The clip shows a woman... I've seen this clip. It's the woman talking into the cell phone. I know this. The clip shows a woman walking by in the background, holding something to her ear, much like you'd hold a cell phone, and she seems to be talking to someone, which is odd because she seems to be alone. Upon taking a closer look, Clark concluded that she was actually talking into what appeared to be a thin black device that could only be a cell phone. Since cell phones hadn't been invented yet, that could only mean one thing. The woman was a time traveler. Or it was photoshopped, or something else is going on. Of course, skeptics always have to ruin the party, and they came to a completely different conclusion. The woman isn't talking on the phone, she's using a hearing aid. According to Philippa Skroska, an archivist at Bernard Becker Medical Library of Washington University in St. Louis, not all hearing aids look like trumpets. Short, compact, regular-shaped hearing aids weren't that unusual. In 1925, Western Electric developed a device smaller than 8 by 4 inches that weighed less than 2 pounds, which would easily fit into one hand. This seems so massive for a hearing aid today, but I guess back in the day you're like, wow, technology! For that matter, even if it was a phone, there aren't any cell towers or satellites. So yeah, it's not going to work. You get back in time with your mobile phone, that shit's going to say no service. So a cell phone in 1928 would be about as useful as a refrigerator in the Arctic Circle. Besides, movie premieres at Grauman's Chinese Theatre were, and actually still are, considered a high-class affair, and the woman in a top hat and long fur coat would probably have been able to afford the latest in hearing aid gadgetry. This seems like an open and shut case. However, the woman is clearly talking to someone, even looking around a bit like people tend to do when they're talking on phones. Sure, there were no cell towers, but perhaps she's from further along in our timeline and hails from an era where cell phones no longer need towers. Yeah, maybe she's got some sort of futuristic phone, which she can use to talk through time. If you told Sir William Thomson, the man who invented a tide-predicting machine in 1872, that by 2025 we're all going to be walking around with computers in our pockets, he probably would have you checked into Bedlam. So is it so far-fetched to believe that another 50 or 100 years we'll no longer need cell towers? I don't think it's far-fetched at all. Others have a slightly more contemporary explanation. The woman isn't making a call, she's using the phone to record what she's seeing and experiencing, like any other good researcher out in the wild wood. So, is this a rich, perhaps little batty elderly lady talking to herself, which I can totally see in my future? Not me, Ilsa, who wrote the script. Or a keen time-traveling anthropologist taking notes of the natural habitat of 1920s flappers. Next up, we have some interesting footage from 1938. The clip is 7-minute reel showing workers coming out of the DuPont plant in Leominster, Massachusetts. Pretty sure MA, Massachusetts, right? In October 1938. It was uploaded in 2017 by the Leominster Access Television YouTube channel, which sounds like a real fun place to be, and the footage hasn't been altered in any way, it's all genuine. Around the 40-second mark, we see a young woman apparently talking on some kind of communication device before putting it away. Now, once again, there were no cell phones around at the time, so, well, what's going on here? Of course, the first explanation would be a modern hearing aid. By 1938, there were definitely smaller hearing aids available. Others suggest that she's holding a cigarette case or listening to a small portable radio while chatting to her friends about whatever they're listening to. Yep. Entirely possible, because it's not a mobile phone, is it? Since small portable radios didn't exist in 1938 any more than cell phones did, that does seem a bit unlikely. Oh, okay, no little portable... I guess not, right? They used to be big old things. Even when I was a kid in the 90s, radios, you could have a tiny radio. They just always assumed that maybe they were tiny, but they're not. They weren't always tiny. However, the story took an interesting twist in 2013 when an anonymous YouTube user came forward with what appears to be some new information. Apparently, the woman in the footage is the user's great-grandmother, a woman called Gertrude Jones. At the time, how could you possibly know? Okay. At the time the footage was taken, Gertrude was 17 years old working at the DuPont plant. Apparently, the plant had a telephone communications section where they were experimenting with wireless telephones. They gave 6 of their female employees, one of them being Gertrude, these wireless phones to test out for 1 week. Really? In 1938? It's kind of amazing. In the clip, Gertrude is talking to one of the scientists who is also on a wireless phone, somewhere off to her right, though either he didn't make it into the footage, or he was a little more discreet than our young Ms. Jones. The story has never been verified, but it's not like we have solid, indisputable evidence for any of our other time travel stories, so we'll take it. This seems like a fairly reasonable explanation, doesn't it? But there is a tiny problem. A wireless phone still needs a power source. These days, the batteries are very small, but this footage was taken well before World War II. While the history of batteries are fascinating, if a bit dry, after some poking around, I came to the conclusion that while smaller batteries did exist in 1938, they weren't nearly strong enough to power something as complex as a mobile wireless telephone. As one YouTuber pointed out, the walkie-talkie used by radio operators in 1936 to talk to their home base miles away needed a two-man team. One to carry and operate the radio, and one to carry the 30 pounds, that's 18 kilogram battery and receiver. Holy shit. That's a big-ass battery. I don't believe a portable phone would have needed a 30 pounds battery, but considering how bulky the first mobile phones were back in 1973, I find it highly unlikely that young Mrs. Jones was chatting away on a 1938 mobile phone. No, I also don't find it likely, but also, I feel like mobile phones were also small at some point. I remember when I was a kid, like really young, one of my earliest memories is my dad having a mobile phone, but it wasn't big. It didn't have a screen. God, could this be one of those things where you just don't remember things correctly? But I swear it worked on like a different technology or something. It was more like a radio. Like it could pick up like cab, like taxi broadcasts and stuff. But it was this little mobile phone and had this little flip down bit that you'd speak into. But it wasn't big, especially not compared to the mobile phones that they had later, which were fucking big things. So are we looking at a young woman innocently putting away a cigarette case, which she for some reason was holding to her ear, or do we finally have proof of time travel? Maybe she was like, there could be so many reasons. Like she's got a cigarette in one hand, she's got the thing and it's kind of open and she's like, doing some sort of maneuver to close it. The chronovisor. Oh, I know this one. This one is particularly ridiculous. It's something about the Pope has like some sort of magical vision. This one isn't so much a person that traveled through time, but rather people looking back into time using a time viewer. The chronovisor is supposed to be a bizarre cabinet-like contraption, complete with confusing buttons and gadgets, designed to allow the user to view history as it's happening. Unfortunately, it only had image, not sound, but still, it's quite an extraordinary invention if true. Yeah, and you know what? It's not, because it's not true. This one is definitely fake. I know it, I promise. This one is ridiculous. Let's find out more. Everything we know about the chronovisor comes from one Father Francois Brunet, a Catholic priest who mentions the chronovisor in a 2002 book, The New Mystery of the Vatican. Apparently, the contraption was built by another priest called Pellegrino Ernetti, working with some of the world's greatest scientists in the 20th century. Ernetti was a well-respected priest who specialized in archaic music and was described by his peers as a quiet intellectual. He wrote quite a few books on archaic music, and while working with a recording of some Gregorian chants, our priest apparently had another strange experience which led him to build the chronovisor in the first place. He was working at the Catholic University of Milan with a fellow priest when they unexpectedly heard the voice of the second priest's father coming from the speaker. There was no explanation for how this happened. I guess the father could have been present when the recording was made, but either this wasn't considered or it wasn't possible for some reason or another. Yes, like we said, these stories don't always make very much sense, do they? The experience led Ernetti to ponder what else might have been recorded accidentally through history, and if there was any way to listen to these unintentional recordings. He ended up working with a team of 12 scientists, including Enrico Fermi and Werner von Braun. The others wished to remain anonymous. Can't say I blame them. Apparently the chronovisor used cathode ray tubes and antennae made from some unnamed mysterious material which could detect light and sound and then convert those different wavelengths into a visual display that could be watched on a monitor like a TV. I'm not an engineer, so this could be complete box, but that's the story. Apparently, Ernetti kept the device a secret for years before finally spilling his guts in a 1972 interview in an Italian publication. No. According to Ernetti, it made good use of his contraption. He swung by the crucifixion to get a snapshot of Jesus on the cross, which seems a little improper if you ask me, as well as scenes from ancient Rome, including the speech of Marcus Cicero, and even a performance of the lost play Thyestes, written between 239 BCE and 169 BCE by Roman playwright Seneca. If I'm remembering rightly, it was either his photo of Jesus or something, which he has these photos, but it turns out it was just like a picture of a statue, and they identified the statue that it was. It was like, guys, it's identical. This is a photo of the statue. And people are still like, oh, maybe the chronovisor's real. It's not. Much of his work has unfortunately been lost over the years. Yeah, I don't know if we can describe that as... sorry, Seneca's work. I thought you meant this guy's work, the Chronovisor guy. But luckily for Rossetti, he got to see the play performed and even managed to transcribe a part of the play into what he claimed was the original Latin. Honestly, I'd imagine there are slightly more important historic moments to transcribe, but the man was a priest, so okay then. Unsurprisingly, there are some doubts about the transcripts, as experts claim that some of the words used didn't show up in Latin until centuries after the actual play was produced, and the writer also doesn't seem to be fluent in Latin, which the original playwright most likely were. And the photo of the crucifixion? Well, that turned out to be an image on a postcard. Oh, okay, so it was, I think it was like the postcard's image was of a statue, and then he just took a picture of the postcard or something. It was ridiculous. However, while we mere mortals doubt, it seems the Vatican took it seriously enough. They apparently passed a decree in 1988 that anyone using an instrument like this to check out the past would be excommunicated. Why? I beg the understanding of the audience when I admit that I didn't dig very deep into papal decrees from the Vatican to find this decree, because I would like to finish this script sometime this century. Critics claim that Rossetti eventually fessed up, admitting that he'd made the whole thing up. However, believers claim Rossetti insisted that the Chronovisor was real until his dying day and was only made to say that he invented the story by either the church or some shadowy global organization trying to take over the world. I guess it's up to you to decide which one is more likely there, audience. Did a random dude make up a time-traveling VR headset? Or is there a shadowy world master government suppressing the truth? How exactly this shadowy cabal is going to control the world, if they can only look into the past, not actually change anything, I'm not entirely clear on, but apparently Rossetti was concerned that his contraption could fall into the wrong hands, so to keep it safe, it's now hidden away in the secret archives of the Vatican. So much for keeping it out of the wrong hands, indeed. By the way, I'll use this moment in the video to tell you, if you would like to purchase this script with my squiggle on it, all of the scripts that we've recorded here at Decoding the Unknown are available on our merch store. And that pen smells like something else. I've mentioned this before, but every time I open it, I'm like, oh wow, yeah, that pen. So maybe you'll get some of that on there. Probably not. The stink will have gone off by the time it gets to you. So pick one of these up. There's a link below. Mike Madman Markham. Next up, we have Mike Markham, who would eventually end up with the nickname Madman, though, to be fair, it's not nearly as mad as some other supposed time travelers that I've come across, so I'm not entirely sure the nickname is fair, but I'll let you decide for yourself. Mike was a young man living in Stanbury, Missouri, when his experiments into time travel first began. He'd spent 2 years on an electrical training course at Rio Grande College in Ohio before moving to Missouri. Stanbury wasn't exactly the most happening place to be in 1993. There wasn't really much to do for a young man when he found himself with a bit of time on his hands. Mike was bright though, and in his free time he built electrical equipment as a hobby. In December 1993, he built a Jacob's ladder, a very basic experiment where 2 metal rods are attached to a transformer. When the transformer is turned on, electrons jump from one rod to the other, creating an arc of light, which climbs up between the 2 rods, climbing like a ladder. I don't know if is that how ladders work? It's a popular experiment for science teachers trying to get bored students interested in electricity, and this was basically all our man Mike had in mind when he set up the experiment on the kitchen table. But something strange happened. Along with the expected arcs of electricity, a ball of heat, which happened to look a bit like a vortex, formed just above the ladder. Mike couldn't really explain how that had happened or what he was actually looking at, so he tossed a small metal screw into the vortex to see what would happen. For a second it disappeared, only to suddenly reappear, sitting innocently on the table beside the transformer. Obviously, and somewhat admirably all things considered, Mike's first explanation wasn't time travel. No, indeed, as it shouldn't be. He initially thought it might be some phenomenon related to light bending, which could basically turn something invisible, but that meant that the screw had dropped down silently because he didn't hear the sound of a screw dropping or rolling away after tossing it through the vortex. However, after giving it some thought, he realized that there might be another explanation. The screw had, in fact, been transported a few seconds into the future and only reappeared when time caught up with it. He tossed in a few more screws just to make sure he wasn't actually hallucinating or something, but before he could borrow a camcorder to record the whole thing, his experiment caught fire since it's not actually supposed to run so long at such a high voltage. He managed to put out the fire before any damage was done, but his equipment was destroyed. Okay, well, this guy's made the most useless time machine in existence. What does it do? Well, it did last very long and it moved screws slightly forward in time. Initially, Mike kept this great discovery to himself, but he wanted to continue testing and build something much bigger. The vortex, which supposedly transported the screws, was about the size of a dime, but you'd need something much bigger to transport a person. However, that would require more parts, and our man Mike had a bit of a cash flow problem. I'm sure we can relate. So, in early 1995, Mike helped himself to some transformers that actually belonged to the St. Joseph Light and Power Generating Station in King City. Did he steal these? The transformers were sitting unused near a substation, so I suppose our would-be time traveler figured they wouldn't be missed. According to some reports, they were sitting behind a padlocked fence, but Mike disputed this version of events. Yes, as he might. The 6 transformers weighed about 250 to 350 pounds and cost around $300,000 each. Holy shit, in 1990s money, that's got to be what, like $500,000 today? God damn. Bro, this is like stealing stuff that could get you to prison, dude. That's like, how many did you steal? How many did he steal? Was it 3? It's like $1 million. That's a lot of money. The authorities started looking into the stolen transformers while Mike got to work on his second time machine. In late January, Mike was finally ready to turn on his machine, and he wisely hooked it up directly to the electrical grid. Wise. However, the power grid wasn't meant to power time machines, so instead the entire area started to experience blackouts. It didn't take long for authorities to put all the pieces together, and Mike was promptly arrested. The authorities weren't buying it, but once the Associated Press got wind of the story, it didn't take long for Mad Mike's time travel dreams to hit the headlines. Of course, building a time machine is not considered a good enough reason for breaking the law, and Mike was sent to prison for 2 months and then got probation for another 5 years for borrowing the Transformers without permission. Yeah, that feels fair. I feel like the I'm building a time machine defense could be quite good, because you'd be like, yeah, no, I needed it for my time machine. They'd be like, bro doesn't belong in prison. Bro belongs in he needs help. Prison didn't dampen Mike's passion for time travel, and he stuck to his story. He even had notebooks filled with schematics for his proposed time machine. While most people thought he was a little nuts, there were some people who were quite keen on helping Mike achieve his dreams of time travel. It was after his release from prison that he ended up on Coast to Coast radio show with presenter Art Bell, where he told the whole story. Apparently, Coast to Coast covered all sorts of paranormal stories and unexplained events over the years. I've heard of it before, and I've heard of Art Bell. Definitely come up in a Decoding the Unknown episode before, for sure. So this was the perfect audience for our good friend Mike, who appeared on the show twice, once in 1995 and once in 1997. After his first appearance, he got all sorts of donations, both money and equipment, to make another go at building a time machine. He was given space in a warehouse to work. Really? He'd also left Missouri for Kansas City by this point, so it seemed like everything was working out well for our wannabe time traveler. Over the next couple of years, from 1995 to 97, Mike worked hard at his time machine, running experiments with guinea pigs, which, according to Mike, would reappear in the east or west side of the warehouse after being sent through the vortex. That must have been very confusing for the poor guinea pigs. During his second appearance in 97, he told listeners that he was only around 30 days away from actually testing the machine on a human being, and being the scientist he was going to test it on himself. He even gave listeners an address they could go to see the whole thing happening for themselves. But shortly after this second interview, our man simply vanished. I get the feeling he might have not been spending money on guinea pigs, and might have been spending money on himself. And by spending money, I mean just stealing it. There was a lot of speculation about Mike's fate for the next 20 years. Some believe Mike had actually managed to travel back in time, but got trapped. One listener even contacted Art Bell with a story about a body found on a beach in the 1930s, stuffed in a weird metal tube with a strange device that looked like a modern cell phone. Apparently, Mike said that the only thing he would be taking with him was his cell phone. However, then he also believed that Mike was just a fraud. Yes. And there were reports of him living homeless, including one report in Hawaii in 2011. If you're going to be homeless, where better than the beach? Yeah, fully agree. If you're going to be homeless, you want to be homeless in like Hawaii. Finally, a reporter tracked down our time traveler and got the scoop. According to Mike, he finally managed to make his machine work in 1998. He traveled through the vortex to arrive in the year 2000 in a field in Fairfield, Ohio, around 600 miles away from the warehouse. Unfortunately, time travel had an unintended side effect, amnesia, of course, so initially our man had no idea what had happened or who he was. However, his memory slowly returned over the next couple of years, and he eventually made his way back to his warehouse, only to find his time machine and all his notes gone. In 2015, a man claiming to be Mike Markham appeared on Art Bell's new show, Midnight in the Desert. Of course, whether this was the original Mike, we don't actually know for sure, but the 2015 audience was far less impressed with the now 41-year-old Mike Markham. Our time traveler, well, he was really young when he was doing all that original stuff. Our time traveler claimed that he planned to build yet another time machine, but at this stage he didn't have the money, so he's just working odd jobs. However, this time there were no donations. Yeah, because the last time they just disappeared. Of course, scientists don't believe that Mike managed to build a time machine, as his machine doesn't actually fit into any known theories about gravity and time travel. Most notably, the one that is like time travel doesn't work. Critics also point out that Mike claimed to have suffered from amnesia, but there's no missing persons report on file, so if he went missing, it doesn't seem like anyone noticed his absence. Ouch. So, did Mike Markham travel through time? Was the interview and the 2015 radio appearance the same Mike Markham, or just an imposter trying to con people out of more money, while the real Mike is trapped somewhere in the past, in a time before electricity, hot showers, and pineapple on pizza? Yeah, I don't know. I don't care if it's a new guy trying to con people out of money. The whole thing was a big con. Time traveling in Liverpool. While it's easy enough to dismiss a single time traveler or maybe two as fraudsters making up wild tales, it becomes a little harder when you have multiple people claiming similar experiences in the same place. Very curious. All of the things so far have been very easy to dump on. This sounds slightly more challenging. I'm sure I'll find a way. For this time travel event, we're heading to the city of Liverpool, most famous for the Beatles, but apparently also the place you want to be if you feel like taking a trip to the past. Over the years, there have been a lot of people claiming to have experienced time slips on Bold Street. In 1996, a former police officer called Frank and his wife Carol were out shopping in Bold Street. Carol wanted to visit the bookstore, while Frank wanted to go to a nearby music shop, so they agreed to meet up again after about 20 minutes. After browsing some records and CDs, Frank headed back to the bookstore to meet his wife, but something just felt off. The street was suddenly much quieter than it had been before, or at least it was until he almost got hit by a van blasting its horn. The name Cardins was written on the side of the van. Being a retired cop, Frank knew most businesses in town and had never heard of Cardins before. The truck was from the 50s, but looked brand new. When was this happening? The 90s? 1996, okay. The truck was from the 50s, but it looked brand new. Frank looked around and noticed that the entire street had changed, and people were now all dressed in 1950s style clothes. He crossed the street looking for the bookstore only to find that the shop had gone. In its place was a clothing shop with the name Cripps hanging over the door and a window display of women's shoes and handbags. Not a book in sight. Frank, being a cop, didn't panic, but he wasn't sure what to do. In this situation, I'll be like, whoa, I'm having a really weird-ass dream, or my brain needs checking out. The police manual never covered time travel. However, a young woman wearing modern clothes, later identified as Julie French, approached the store and Frank opened the door for her. The two entered the store only to discover that the clothing store was suddenly a bookstore again, to Frank's great relief. Julie was confused though. She thought it was a new clothing store, not a bookshop. Julie later did some interviews on podcasts and TV shows, so it's not a name I just pulled out of thin air for the more skeptical in our audience. Frank was intrigued by the experience and did a bit of research on Bold Street. He discovered Cripps was indeed a women's clothing store that existed on Bold Street, where the bookstore is, but back in the 50s. Cardins was also a pretty well-known company in the 50s, and they did use vans like the one blasting its horn at Frank. But Frank is just one of many. Okay, because if it's just Frank, it's just Frank. Crazy old Frank. In 2006, Sean, a young man in possession of some merch that he didn't exactly come by legally, was running from a security guard. So just a regular Monday afternoon on the streets of Liverpool. He turned onto Hanover Street at the end of Bold Street and ducked into Brooks Alley. Suddenly felt dizzy and his chest tightened, so he stopped to catch his breath. Remember, future thieves, don't skimp on the cardio. He waited a bit to make sure the coast was clear before stepping back onto Hanover Street, eventually crossing over to Bold Street, and found that everything looked different. The buildings looked older, the air smelled different, and the street was lined with old cars and people dressed in clothes from the 50s or 60s. Unlike every other time traveler so far, our thief didn't know enough about fashion to tell the difference, which actually makes me more inclined to believe his story. Sean started to panic a bit, grabbing his cell phone, but there was no signal. He walked to a newspaper stand to check the date and was a wee bit surprised to see that the date was May the 18th, 1967. Unsure what to do, Sean wandered around a bit, taking in the stores with vintage items and posters advertising events that had happened a very long time ago. Eventually, he made his way back to Brooks Alley, and once again the atmosphere shifted and suddenly the street was busy again. His phone had signal, everything had returned to normal. Apparently, years later, a journalist tracked down Sean for his story, and Sean's version of events never changed. The journalist even looked up the security guard who chased him, and the guard confirmed that he had been chasing a shoplifter down Hanover Street, but when he finally got to the alley, it was empty, so he just assumed the thief had given him the slip somehow. Of course, I couldn't actually find the name of the journalist or the story he or she wrote about the incident, but as time slips go, this is one of the more believable ones I've heard. Yeah, more believable, still really, really not believable. Just, it all comes back to extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's just not here, is it? Finally, and this story is my favorite, in the 90s, a group of urban explorers were exploring the Williamson Tunnels, a labyrinth of passages beneath the streets of Liverpool. Ooh, back in Liverpool, are we? So, okay, I guess this is all part of the same. It's 3 in 1, or 4 in 1? 3 in 1. Suddenly, the group heard the sound of people shouting, and as they turned a corner, they found themselves in a bustling underground market. People were dressed in Victorian clothes and sold goods from wooden carts. There was the sound of haggling and the smell of fresh produce. However, just as quickly as it appeared, the market vanished again, and the group found themselves standing in a large empty cavern. I did a bit of checking, and while Liverpool never had an official underground market, like what was found in the Edinburgh vaults, the Williamson Tunnels are a bit of a mystery. The tunnels were built around 1910 by tobacco merchant Joseph Williamson, but he never told anyone why or what he intended to use the tunnels for. Maybe just like tunnels. Some excavation for the tunnels have been carried out in recent years, and all kinds of fascinating artifacts were found, but unfortunately, the tunnels were used as landfill for many years, so whether these artifacts are of an unknown market or just stuff people throw away, we don't actually know. There are many, many more stories about time slips on Bold Street to be found on forums all over the internet. Some of these are obvious fabrications, with the storytellers claiming to have visited shops that never existed on Bold Street or seeing things that don't match with the time they supposedly visited. However, some of the stories have a ring of truth to them. So is Liverpool, especially Bold Street, the place any aspiring time traveller should have on their bucket list, or are the folks of Liverpool just really good storytellers? It's the latter. The science of time travel. We've heard all the stories, but what does science have to say on the subject? Is it actually possible to travel through time? The good news is that not only is it possible, you're doing it right now. Admittedly, you're only moving at 1 second per second, but by the time you finish watching this video, you'll be around 45 minutes into the future from where you started. Ooh. You've underestimated the length of time of this video, depending on tangents. All right, there we go. Heavy on the tangents today, apparently. It's not often that we have science on our side on this channel. According to Einstein's special theory of relativity, the flow of time depends on how fast you're moving. The faster you're moving, the slower time passes. According to Einstein's general theory of relativity, yes, he had to come up with 2 of them, gravity also affects time. The stronger the immediate gravity, the slower time goes by. What this means is that near huge bodies like the surface of the planet Earth or neutron stars, time moves a teensy bit slower than it does much further away. Ooh, for a neutron star, I think it would move quite a bit slower, because that is a different level of heavy compared to the Earth. Of course, the difference is very small, so barely noticeable. I don't know. What's up, ChatGPT? I need to know, if I'm standing on the surface of a neutron star, how much slower is time going? Is it a lot or not very much?
Hey there. So, standing on the surface of a neutron star is definitely one of those extreme physics
Just
scenarios.
tell me the answer.
Absolutely. Keeping it simple. Time would slow down a lot. On the surface of a neutron star, time for you would tick significantly slower compared to someone far away in space. It's not just a tiny bit, it's a pretty substantial gravitational time dilation. So yeah, time definitely drags out.
How much slower compared to someone on Earth?
Right, so to give you a ballpark, if you were standing on the surface of a neutron star, time could run maybe dozens or even hundreds of times slower than it does on Earth. It depends on the star.
Well, holy shit. Not a teeny bit, is it? But if you were to camp out on the edge of a black hole, which is known for its gravitational pull, only a few hours might pass for you while 1,000 years rush by for the Loch Ness Monster cruising around her loch. So, once you return from your camping trip to the nearest black hole, so much time would have passed on Earth that you'd essentially have traveled to the future. However, going backwards in time, a little bit trickier, and many scientists believe it to be impossible. One phenomenon that might make this possible is closed time-like curves. This theoretically happens in a region of space where space-time, warped by intense gravity, loops into itself, so basically you would start traveling forwards in time only to eventually find yourself right back where you started. Instead of traveling in a straight line, time becomes a circle, so if you go far enough into the future, you'll eventually end up in the past. That's enough to make anyone's brain hurt, yes. However, to my knowledge, and I'm no scientist, the idea of time-like curves where space-time goes in a loop is purely theoretical. There's no region in space where this has actually happened yet. There's been some research done into creating time machines that would allow time travel, but so far, no one has been successful. You would know if they had. Or maybe you wouldn't. Most scientific models looking at how to make time travel possible rely on things like negative mass, creating wormholes, which is basically a tunnel in space-time, or finding a way to harness the energy of black holes, which so far, no one has been able to do. Science says time travel is possible, but time slips are not. Yet the majority of time travel stories we have are people experiencing time slips. Is it possible there are just some wild things happening out there and science just hasn't caught up yet? No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe, but I'm going to need a lot more than some people with some stories and a photograph of a postcard. Conclusion. Time travel stories are everywhere. Even Blackadder had a time travel adventure where he ended up as Prime Minister, which explains a lot about the state of politics these days. And while I'm a skeptic at heart, I actually think that time travel is one of those sci-fi staples that might one day become a reality. However, do any of these cases prove without a doubt that some folks have actually traveled through time? I'm intrigued, but personally I'm going to need a little more hard evidence before I start making my travel plans. Of course, if time travel becomes possible in the future, you might wonder why we don't have time travelers on the evening news or making money on the stock market. Well, the obvious answer is the Department of Temporal Investigations has had agents everywhere preventing that sort of thing, but more importantly, if someone does show up claiming to be from the future, would you actually believe them? I mean, yes, if they had a preponderance of evidence. And that's the end of today's episode. Thanks for being here.